Greetings and welcome to this latest edition of the Iranian Studies Initiative Lectures in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Barbara. I am Alireza Ardakani with Farhang Foundation here in Los Angeles. We are a 100% member-supported, non-political, non-religious, and not-for-profit organization with the sole mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the global community. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Laetitia Nanquette from the University of New South Wales, who is joining us live from Sydney, Australia, for publishing and the state in Iran from the 1950s to the present. This series is made possible with the support of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, the Persian Heritage Foundation, the California Humanities, and the Geramian Emrani Foundation. Please note that we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of today's program, so please do submit your questions for Dr. Nanquette via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Ali Papoli-Yazdi, PhD candidate in Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Thank you, Alireza. Hello, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's event, Dr. Laetitia Nanquette. Dr. Nanquette is an associate professor at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. Holding a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, Dr. Nanquette's academic journey has taken her through France, the United Kingdom, Iran, and the United States before joining the University of New South Wales in Australia. Her scholarly contributions have garnered significant recognition. She is the author of the award-winning book, Orientalism versus Occidentalism, Literary and Cultural Imaging Between France and Iran Since the Islamic Revolution, I.B. Tauris, 2013, and Iranian Literature After the Islamic Revolution, Production and Circulation in Iran and the World, Edinburgh University Press, 2021. Without further ado, I kindly invite Dr. Nanquette to commence her presentation. Dr. Nanquette, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thanks so much, Ali and Alireza, and thanks a lot to my host also, Janet Afari, and to the Farhang Foundation. Thanks for your very warm introduction. It's I'm really delighted to be here this morning in Sydney. I'm going to share my screen. So the publishing industry is always critical in terms of crisis during wartime, for example, and in authoritarian regimes like Iran, which needed to circulate their ideologies and to invest in the construction of their identity. Publishing has a strong impact on the functioning of a society. It influences its developments, but it's also influenced by trends happening in that society. So it's a two-way relationship. So today, I want to discuss the evolutions of the publishing industry in Iran to help us understand how the printed word helped shape and transform Iranian society over the past 70 years. So I want to do this by looking specifically at the role that the state plays in the publishing industry. And of course, the Pahlavi monarchy and the Islamic Republic are very different political regimes, but there's also continuity. In both cases, they are largely authoritarian regimes, and they're invested in cultural matters like publishing. So I will aim to answer a few questions today. What's the role of the state in the Iranian publishing industry between the 1950s to the present, and how does this role evolve as the industry itself changes? And also, how are these evolutions entangled? In order to do so, I will discuss the historical context, the legal framework, and the state interventions, including censorship, that have shaped the publishing industry over this period. I'm going to say a few words on the periodization from the 1950s to the present. Because the publishing industry and the cultural field in general are so intertwined with political developments, it's quite difficult to avoid, the common divisions that we have in Iranian modern history. So I will follow the general distinction dividing the period from 1953 and the coup against Mossadegh to the 1979 revolution, and then from the revolution to the present. However, I want to insist on the fact that it's important to see that these ruptures are not always as radical as we think in the cultural field. You do have continuities between the periods, not only during the transition times, but for long periods, and we need to think about these continuities. Coups and revolutions lead to structural changes in the cultural field, but sometimes, people stay in place. Some institutions' names get replaced, but their functioning doesn't change so much. So I will show how this is the case to some extent in Iran from the angle of the publishing industry. I want to address a seeming paradox first, because some of you might have in mind, the idea that there's a low literacy rate during the Pahlavi regime. The literacy rates increases a lot during the Islamic Republic, but there's a low reading rate per capita. So how do we reconcile this low reading rate with the importance of the publishing industry? How can print be such a powerful medium when not many people read for that period? I argue that the importance of the book is symbolic, but is not linked to a high consumption of books. And a similar argument is made by Franck Mermier in his book, which studies the Arab world publishing industry, where he argues that books are not consumed in high numbers, much like in Iran, but where the power of print is very much recognized by all actors. He details, for example, how reading is not much practiced in public spaces, how the education system is based on rote learning, so that doesn't really encourage a reading culture. And we see a similar inverse proportion in Iran between the symbolic importance of the book and the consumption of the book, which is quite low for the period studies. So now, what do we mean when we talk about the publishing industry? I discuss the publishing industry with a focus on books, so both print and digital in the modern period. And of course, what constitutes a book is always contentious in terms of length, in terms of format. There's a UNESCO definition, which is quite helpful, which defines it as a non-periodical printed publication of at least 49 pages, excluding covers. It's not a perfect definition, but it works for most of my analysis. However, it's important to remember that there are periods when Iran's way of counting books doesn't align with the UNESCO definitions. You might have heard of the term Kitab Sazi. And for example, during the Ahmadinejad presidency, the practice described as Kitab Sazi, which literally means making up books, this really boomed. So it meant that, for example, master and PhD theses were counted as books, while they should not have been, according to the UNESCO definition. But this was made in order to mitigate the fact that less books were approved and published during Ahmadinejad's presidency than before. So to make it look less drastic, they used Kitab Sazi. A last thing I want to say on definition is that it's important to recognize the connections between print and digital, as well as other forms of text in the period we're looking at. So books, whether print or digital, are not isolated from other forms of text. My scope is limited to books, but of course there are overlaps and connections. But I do focus on books and exclude the study of newspapers and magazines because the dynamic of their publications is quite different. However, there are sometimes overlaps. For example, publishers of books published important magazines at different periods. Some you can see here, Baresi Kitab, Intertwining Kitab, for example, and some other examples. So this is an example to show that there are blurred lines between books and magazines, and but there are also strict differences which justify my focus on books. The book is expensive. It's got a certain status that newspapers and magazines, which are used in everyday life, don't have. And also newspapers don't convey the same relation to the written word than books. A word on the scope and the sources I've been using. So I've been using primary and secondary material, archives from publishers, memoirs by publishers, oral history based on interviews with publishers, as well as fieldwork in Tehran between 2005 and 2017. I focus on the Persian language because that makes up the bulk of publishing. However, it's important to remember that there are also publishers and books in other languages, Azerbaijani Turkish, Armenian, Kurdish, Arabic, although on a small scale, due partly to the heavy Persianization imposed by the Iranian state both before and after the revolution. So this talk's premise is that the political field is critical to publishing, and the political and literary fields are intertwined in ways that we don't see in most Western countries during the same period. The publishing industry in Iran is very heavily invested by the state, and it's also a space contested by both independent and underground publishers. So what I aim to do today is to unpack these networks between the political and the literary field to demonstrate how these complex relations function in the authoritarian context of Iran. So here are a few useful references I've been using. So I start with the middle of the 20th century. I mentioned the coup against Mossadegh, of course, which is critical, but also the 1950s marks the start of the modern publishing period in Iran. That's really when the connection between the industry and society became stronger. And Afshin Marashi has written beautifully on these changes which happened in the first half of the 20th century and then sort of come to fruition in the middle of the century. So around the 1950s, a transition which started several decades earlier saw its achievements when books really had become mostly commodities in a move away from their primary function as beautiful works of art, very often linked to religion. Marashi mentioned this start of the process during the Qajar era, when the book started to lose its deep connection to religion. So it doesn't mean, of course, that religious book disappeared, but they started to be in competition with secular books, which was unimaginable before. And it's not an evolution specific to Iran, nor to the Quran. This transition happened in most countries with strong religious traditions, when books started to lose their sacred character and it became possible to criticize them. And this process is usually associated with modernity, of course. In Iran, this evolution really started to boom in the first decades of the 20th century with the constitutional revolution and was completed by the middle of this century. So once a book has started to lose its sacredness and it became a product, the new mode of reading permitted a new industry to develop. Scholars like Mohammad Tavakkoli Taqi have argued that in the first half of the 20th century, it was newspapers that served to modernize the nation and to consolidate Iranian identity. And I argue that sometimes around the middle of the century, books also started to play this role along with newspapers. Newspapers didn't disappear, they continued to have a very important role, and they've played a role that books couldn't. But the book has more stability and it's a slower product. The time to produce a book is absolutely not the same as that to produce a magazine. So the book acted as a modernizing instrument by creating the idea of a shared identity around a common language, around Persian. So here again, I want to insist on the strong Persianization and the exclusion of languages other than Persian in Iran, with this policy starting in the 20s. So the middle of the century is a time when the scope of publishing became wider, books started to appear on a large scale, and big publishers and cultural institutions started to come in. Universities and institutes of learning also contributed to this dynamism of the book scene. And really, publishing became an industry. Publisher became a job in its own right, different from that of printer, which it was linked to before. And being a writer started to become a profession as well. It was linked to being a Roshanfekr, an intellectual. There were rights becoming to be attached to the profession. Publisher was not just a hobby, and it started to become regulated. We can also note about this professionalization of the publishing industry, the publication of specialist publications like Rahnamai Kitab, a magazine entirely devoted to book reviews and criticism that started in 1958, and that's a testimony to the transformation of the profession. In the 50s, you also have the start of small paperback pocket books, Kitabaye GB. They were affordable, they were widely available. They were started by Franklin Book Program. I'll talk about Franklin in a minute. And this facilitated this opening of books to the everyday reader. So the mention of the reader is important here because the evolution of the literary profession was linked, of course, to the development of readership. Literacy increased a lot through the period. In 1979, it was at 75%. Mass education started, many libraries and bookshops opened, including in the provinces. And there was a development of a middle class for whom education was important. So that all reflects a new society taking shape, which consumed books. First, textbooks at schools, published by the state and standardized, which were very much, the first ones to start this new reading culture. Okay, I want to say a few words about the question of the state and what it means in the Iranian context. That's a few references about the Iranian state. So Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi came to the throne in 1941, replacing his father, Reza Shah. Between 41 and 53, Iran was a constitutional monarchy with an active parliament. But after the coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, the Shah started to exercise his power in an autocratic way. By the early 70s, the country was effectively a one-party state. The state was very much centralized. It was very monolithic. It was also largely autonomous. And this autonomy was fostered by all revenues. So in the late 70s, the Shah attempted to restore some elements of a constitutional monarchy, but it wasn't sufficient to avoid what came to be known as the Islamic Revolution. So in 1979, the Islamic Revolution ends the Pahlavi regime and the monarchy. During the Islamic Republic regime, the state became largely decentralized, but also enlarged. That means you have more state everywhere. And Said Amir Ajamand argues that the reinforcement of the state was really an unintended consequence of the revolution. The state became stronger with the revolution. And it just started to be present in every sphere. So both the Shah's regime and the Islamic Republic function largely in authoritarian ways, with the consequence that the state dominates a number of fields. In the publishing industry, the direct consequence is that the economic and the political fields are intertwined. There's no strong separation between the state and the market like you have in the US or in the UK in modern times. However, if you think about European countries like France or Sweden, for example, you have more intertwining of the state and the economy, not as much as in authoritarian states, but to a greater extent than in the US, for example. France, for example, has a strong interventionist public policy on the book. You've got specific institutions devoted to the book. You've got a fixed book price law. France considers the book as an exception, different from other products. So you see similar tendencies in Iran. And a way, and again, it's a way for me to compare Iran and to show that it's got similar elements to other countries. So what does this look like in terms of publishing? So during the Islamic Republic period, state publishers, for example, compose about 12 to 15% of the publishing industry between 1979 and 2016. I've got some graphs here coming from Majid Gholami Jalis's book, where you can see on the left the number of new governmental publishers in red at the bottom, and the independent publishers in purple. So the high the high line, and on the right you've got the number of books published by governmental publishers and by independent publishers. So the large red number are independent publishers, and the purple is governmental publishers. So that means that independent publishers after the revolution published 7 times more books than state publishers. This might seem like a low number for state publishers, but first we need to remember that these figures come from an official source, Khaneh Kitab, so it might not be absolutely accurate, but I think the range is probably right. But also more importantly, publishers are all in some ways tied to the state, except for underground publishers. Even if their funding comes from private sources, most publishers get support from the state in some way at some point. For example, in the form of paper subsidy, which is a massive expense, which is very expensive in Iran. And that's a very important support from the state until 2007, when the state changed policy on this, but I won't get into the details. In addition, although they don't compose a large portion of the industry, the size of state publishers and the resources they receive make them absolutely essential players in the field. And also, all publishers, of course, have to go through the process of censorship to get their text approved by the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, the echelons. So they need the state's approval and they need to work with the state in some form. So these are all the ways the state imposes its restrictions on the publishing industry. You also have support mechanisms through cultural policies, for example, like the support to publishers through paper, which I mentioned. So when we discuss the role of the state, it's important not to think only about the restrictions, because it's also important to think about the support, because they are the two sides of the same coin. And it's an area where we see a lot of continuities between the Pahlavi regime and the Islamic Republic. During the Pahlavi regime, you have state support for book fairs, you have the Book Week, book awards. You have similar things during the Islamic Republic. The names change, but the mechanisms are pretty much the same. So that's one thing I wanted to insist on. There's the restrictions, but there's also the support, the state deciding to support specific publishers, specific events and mechanisms. The state and the political field play critical roles in the evolution of the literary field, and it's important to understand the negotiations. The Iranian literary field constantly negotiates with political institutions and actors and to influence its developments. Later on, I will have a look at censorship, but for now, I want to have a look at how the state and its ramification account for an important part of the mechanisms of the literary field. So here are a few references about Franklin. I'm going to talk about Franklin in a second. So the effects of World War II and the economic crisis that followed have had a strong impact on the publishing industry. There was a shortage of paper and of infrastructure, and so the state stepped in to help publishers by providing paper. Iran doesn't have enough forest resources to produce papers. There have been some other sources of paper production, but basically paper issues have always been an important element of the Iranian publishing industry and a way for the state to be directly involved in the industry and to take control. The internal politics of Iran account for most of the changes in the role of the state in the publishing industry, and I want to mention two institutions with links to the state to understand this. The first one is the Bonga Tarjome va Nashr Kitab. It was founded in 1954, just a few months after the coup against Mossadegh. It was a not-for-profit, which started the first systematic translations of Western text into Persian, and also translations of children's books. Here are some more archives about the Bonga. And the second institution was one of the major elements of state support from the 50s to the 70s. So the Franklin book programs, I highly recommend Mahdi Ganjavi's book here, which was on the previous slide. So here you've got photos coming from the online material that Princeton Library has recently made accessible. Franklin was a not-for-profit US organization funded by both US government agencies and private corporations. It was intended to promote US values at the time of the Cold War by publishing translations of text. Franklin Book Program started in Tehran in 1953. One of the achievements was to create the first paper plant in Iran that was really significant in expanding the capacity of book production. And Franklin had a vision for the whole industry and tried to find solutions to long-term problems, for example, by developing training programs for Iranian publishers and booksellers. They began with translation commissions. They also expanded into a whole educational and development program. They produced millions of textbooks. They were really the most important state-linked publishing enterprise before the revolution. It had some levels of independence because its main deciding powers were US-based, but it was also very strongly linked to the state apparatus. The state was involved through close relations with the royal family, so ministers and senators of the time, the Shah and his twin sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi, and politicians of the time contributed to translations and articles for Franklin. So Franklin had a major impact on Iranian publishing life. It really dominated the industry and inflected it with American practices. Franklin was dissolved in 1977 due to lack of US funding, and it was confiscated by the state after the Islamic Revolution. So it was merged with Bangeh Tarjomeh, and it became a publisher called Elmi Farhang. Here. So both of them were combined to create a new publisher called Elmi Farhang. Here you've got a letter to Galmarudi, who was a revolutionary poet who was appointed the head of Elmi Farhang, and that mentions the confiscation of Franklin's assets. And here's that's another letter about changing the name from Bangeh Tarjomeh to Entisharat Elmi Farhang. And both letters come from this book, as Rishita Emruz. Sorry. So Elmi Farhang is a well-known post-revolutionary publisher, but its impact and influence doesn't compare at all to that of Franklin. And it's only a publisher. It doesn't have all the whole social and cultural structures that Franklin has created. So Ganjavi says on Franklin that it's an example of how during the Cold War, the United States developed state-private networks in its attempt to compete with communism and the Soviet Union's cultural influence. It's important not to see Franklin as a propaganda organ only. First, because Iranians it was only composed of Iranians. There were no Americans working in the Tehran branch. And also they recruited staff who were often left or center, so not terribly aligned with the Shah. The program was never a simple propaganda machine. It had a high level of agency. So Franklin is a great example of this intertwining of independent and state involvement in the publishing industry, and it adds to that the foreign relations ties. And of course, such ties to foreign powers are one of the elements that the Islamic Revolution was fighting against with its very strong anti-imperialist movement. So we don't have similar collaborations after the revolution, but the state has become even more dominant in the publishing industry after the revolution. So one of the first things that the Islamic Republic does is to confiscate these three big literary institutions. So I mentioned Franklin and Bangeh, which become Elmi Farhang, and Amir Kabir, one of the most important publishers, is also confiscated. So it's interesting to see that there's this confiscation and continuity despite the revolution. After the revolution, the intervention and support of the state in the cultural field takes a different turn. So you've got three main types of government support in that period for the publishing industry. You've got financial support and subsidies for paper, for example. Regulation support, taxation exemption is very important, and control of the prices. And the third one is promotional support. So I mentioned that before, book fairs, international, provincial, in schools, and so on. So the political investment in the literary field is most obvious in the use of the book as an instrument of propaganda, of cultural diplomacy, and also as an instrument of prestige. After the revolution, the government heavily invests in publishing any books as part of its cultural diplomacy. So you can see examples of that in the translated books from Persian. For example, the Islamic Culture and Relations Organization, they mostly translate for countries of the regions that have a strong and majority Shia population to translate and export Persian text. So Persian texts become an instrument of soft power to promote Iran's theological, political ideology across the region. Okay, so now let's move to the last section of this talk where I want to discuss censorship, which is, of course, one of the most important mechanisms of state control before and after the revolution. I want to say that censorship is not only a state institution. Self-censorship is probably the most efficient form of censorship. And every authoritarian regime wants to implement the largest amount of self-censorship so that they have less work to do down the line. So self-censorship is imposed by all actors. It's a regulatory mechanism. The writer imposes it on themselves, the publisher, everyone during the production process. My talk today is about the state, but it's important to remember that self-censorship is very much present. It's not very visible, but it's very powerful in the way that the cultural field functions. Okay, so there's a few references about censorship. So the Iranian literary field has always been highly regulated and censored. Censorship is one visible institution coming from the state that regulates the literary field. It's the institution most often discussed by literary practitioners because it's a very heavy constraint on the field. It's always been present, but you have strong differences according to periods. So it's important to understand these evolutions. It's also worth noting that the state heavily regulates publishing on ideological criteria, but it doesn't regulate in terms of quality. Especially during the Islamic Republic period, the state gave publishing approvals to publishers that were not professional. They published only a couple of books with low print runs per year. So this censorship is not about implementing quality control. It's about the content and about controlling the content. So censorship before the revolution. Between 1941 and 1953, the state wasn't very strong and authors and publishers had some leeway. But in 1953, the coup led to tightening of political thoughts and to reinforcement of monarchical ruling. In its aftermath, members of the National Front and of the Today were purged from political and cultural institutions. The Today had a high proportion of intellectuals, including publishers, in its ranks. And because of this, you could feel the repression very strongly throughout the decade of the 1950s. It's also after the coup that the Shah created the secret police, the SAVAK, in 1957, and it would become the main instrument of censorship and of the repression towards literary practitioners throughout the 60s and 70s. From 1965, books had to follow new regulations as publishers needed to submit copies of the unpublished manuscripts to the Ministry of Information, which would then ask for changes. So there were some pivotal moments in which the issue of censorship was questioned by writers and intellectuals. For example, in 1966, following the protest by intellectuals against new censorship rules, there was a meeting between Prime Minister Oveda and prominent writers like Ahmad Shamnoor, Reza Bahraini, Ghulam Hossein Saedi, Jalal Ahmad, but they couldn't reach an agreement. During the following weeks, censorship became even tighter, and publishers had to submit their publications to the National Library so that each book could be registered. So in light of these legal changes, printing houses were asked to inquire about publishing certificates issued by the Ministry of Art and Culture before accepting to publish a book. Censorship became even tighter in the 1970s because SAVAG began periodic inspection of public and school libraries. The writing bureau, the Idare Negaresh, was linked to the Ministry of Arts and Culture, and it's widely believed in Iran that the head of the writing bureau was a SAVAG agent. It was quite common for a writer whose work had offended the bureau to find himself or herself in prison. Elizabeth Turner mentions an important change in 1977. A regulation was imposed demanding booksellers to keep a record of the names and addresses of all their customers and the titles of the books they bought. This regulation was intended to facilitate the sale of books subsequently blacklisted and the arrest of its purchasers. Iran had an extensive blacklist of writers and their works. So that ties in with an interesting talk that Nahmeh Sohabi gave recently on this topic, on which books you read and how they make you arrested before the revolution during the last years of the Shah. She argues that in the 60s and 70s, the owning, reproducing, and distributing of books defined what it meant to be political, to be siyasi. Books were a trigger for politicization for that generation. On the question of the state, she says, the glue of political identity and books is the state. The Pahlavi state was highly sensitive to books. It expanded what it meant to be political. You might think you're just reading a book, but the state considers this political. So it's very important to think about the role of the state in the cultural sector in that period. At the same time as censorship tightened, there was a revolutionary movement building up, which led to great intellectual activities. One key cultural event, of course, was which discussed these issues of censorship, was the 10 Nights, organized by the Iranian Writers Association and the German Goethe Institute in 1977. Viewed retrospectively, the 10 Nights appear as a symbol of Iranian writers' resistance against Pahlavi authoritarianism in the cultural field, although it didn't result in actual changes straight away. So what was censorship like during the Pahlavi regime? Fariborz Khosravi has a really great book analyzing instances of censorship reports under the Shah, and he came up with several categories that were systematically coming back in the reports. So here are the 5 categories is coming up with. I might let you have a read while I'll have a sip of water. All right, so you have these 5 categories. So it might ring a bell with maybe what some of you have experienced during the Islamic regime period. It's not terribly different in terms of content censored. And of course, I mentioned self-censorship before, which needs to be taken into account as people internalize red lines. So in the revolutionary years between 1977 and about 1983, there was a window of opportunity for publishing. And Shora Makarimi and Hannah Darabi have a great book on the topic called Engelab Street. They study all these books and pamphlets coming out during this transition period. So there was an effervescence of publishing, especially books and pamphlets. They were known as Jal Safid, white covers, because they were published quickly, cheaply. They had white covers to avoid being noticed. And newspapers started to be restricted earlier, from the end of 1979 with the press law, but books could continue a bit after. So let's continue by talking about censorship after the 1979 revolution. So in an ideological regime like Iran, censorship is not only about forbidding discussions of sex, religion, and politics. It's also about imposing a vision. It's about imposing an Islamic ideal. So censorship should always be understood with its counterpart, propaganda, and the way the state implements its ideals by pushing for certain text and promoting certain visions and supporting, as I mentioned earlier, supporting certain writers, certain publishers, and certain institutions. A big difference between censorship before and after the revolution is that supporting of a specific ideal, which you don't see to that extent with the Shah. So while censorship was mostly prohibitive before the revolution, it also became prescriptive after the revolution. Hamad Karimi mentions this. The most prominent example is the cultural production of the Sacred Defense, of course, the Defai Moqaddas, which is devoted to promoting the ideals of the Iran-Iraq war. And the state is heavily involved in that sector and in promoting that type of cultural production. So what does the law say on censorship? Article 24 states of the Islamic Iranian constitution adopted at the end of 1979 states publications in the press are free to discuss issues unless such is deemed harmful to the principles of Islam or the rights of the public. The law shall determine the details of these exceptions. And of course, details and limits vary very much according to periods and stakeholders. In July 1980, a decree by the Revolutionary Tribunal of Tehran established censorship officially. It would ask that any document printed would require the seal of the Ministry of Islamic Guidance. And Makaremi Darabi argues that the control of publication was taken to a new level by the end of 1981 with the advent of anti-terrorist laws and also very bloody repressions against anyone who produced, distributed, and even possessed books critical of the government or labeled as being offensive against Islam. In 1983, the Ministry of Islamic Guidance was incorporated with a new book office. So the book office was able to order the modification of words and phrases and grant publication licenses where needed. And really by that time, the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1980 and finished in 1983, was very much finished. It had purged the universities. It had tried to Islamize knowledge. So from 1983, there were all restrictions in place for a very strict regime of censorship. And it has stayed strong for the period despite some variations. But it's only in 1988 that censorship became regulated through a legal text, which was then revised in 2010. And we're still, the 2010 text is still the one being applied today. So both of these texts, the 1988 and 2010, specify how censorship should work and what should be censored. They're quite vague and open to interpretation, which means that writers and publishers must guess and have some leeway to negotiate according to circumstances, and they must work with the variations of the political climate of the time. The Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance is the one that gives permits to allow publishers to first publish and then distribute their books. But outside of these regulations, you also have pressures from the state on publishing, such as attacks by Hezbollah on bookstores, state monopoly of paper, on the equipment needed for printing, and all these supports from the state that I mentioned, which goes towards governmental and state publishers, but not towards independent publishers. Despite these regulations and pressures, you do have independent publishers, of course, but also underground publishers that have learned to circumvent some of these restrictions. Have learned to negotiate with the censors, and they've, created a space for publishing. It's not easy, but they do exist, and they're very adaptable. What is cut, what is adapted is subject to negotiation, and the unpredictability of the system is also a way for some writers and publishers to get some books through. Just a few references about censorship post-revolution. One book by Ahmad Rajabzadeh in Persian, which is really interesting, that studies all the censorship reports of the year 1996. So that really helps to understand the details and limits of censorship. And a book in English by Ali Reza Abiz. To finish on censorship, I want to say a word on online publishing. My argument is that it only partly disrupts the censorship that takes place in print, which I've discussed. The online censorship process is managed by different entities and the Eshad, so the different people. And you do have a few more spaces of negotiations open online. When digital publishing and online publishing started, you had a couple of years when it was easier to publish a lot more things online. Today, things are a bit more regulated, but it's still possible to publish on a web page something that would never get permission to print without being prosecuted. But largely today, online and print censorship reproduce similar mechanisms. There's slightly less censorship online, but the state is still very effective. So I'll get to my conclusion because I want to have time for discussion. So this talk has offered an overview of the role of society in the publishing industry in Iran over a 70-year period. I've argued that under the regimes of both the Shah and the Islamic Republic, there's heavy regulation of the publishing industry by the state, and also entanglement between the political and literary field. I've also argued that there are many continuities between how the two regimes function in their relation to publishing. What would be a good follow-up study, and which I hope to do, is to look at what the consequences of this entanglement are on the formation of the underground, the informal space, the Zir Zamini space, because it's an example of the fluidity of this publishing industry. The functioning of the Iranian industry is different from publishing industries in most Western countries, and it's important to make parallels to understand the nuances of the field. For example, it'd be interesting to look at examples of countries that have state-controlled publishing industries, such as the Soviet Union and China. So that would make very compelling comparisons. And I want to finish on a note of optimism for scholarship. The study of the publishing industry in Iran is very new, and book history methods and theories can help us to understand a very important sector of the Iranian society. Book history as a field didn't really exist as an academic discipline in Iran, but there's a lot of material in Persian, so it's really exciting to work on this field and to dig into this material. I'll stop for now. Thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to your thoughts and comments. And here are my details if you want to get in touch, ask me questions, and I'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nanquette, for your wonderful presentation. I learned a lot from your talk. Thank you so much. Okay, there are several questions here. I want to start with Dr. Janet Afari's question. Can you talk about the remarkable explosion of feminist publishing houses and the kind of censorship they face?
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful question, and something I'm hoping to work next in the next month or so. Yeah, feminist publishing houses, and even without being feminist, just having a woman as a publisher is quite recent, post-revolution. So I want to look at that, but I don't have answers for now. They do face a specific kind of censorship. And I want to say that the cultural field is very male-dominated. Again, Iran is not very specific in that regard. The publishing industry can be seen as quite a conservative field, and until very recently in most Western countries, it was a very male-dominated field. you used to see, families like the father gave the direction to the son or to the nephew, and it's only in the last sort of 3 or 4 decades that in Western countries you see more feminization. So I think we'll see something like this happening in Iran. But the field is very much still male dominated at all levels of society. But you do have wonderful female publishers, and I'll have more to say about this soon. Thank you.
The second question is about the role of popular authors and encouragement of public to read books. The question is, thanks for your presentation. What is your opinion about the influence of Ray Etemadi? And for the audience, I want to say that Ray Etemadi is one of the most popular authors in Iran. What is your opinion about the influence of Ray Etemadi on encouragement of public to read books?
Right, I'm just trying to find the question. Oh, okay, I see. Thank you. Yeah, popular literature is a very interesting topic, because I would say that the Iranian literary field is quite elitist. You have very strong networks of hybrid writers, publishing with the same publishers, giving prizes to similar type of writers, and popular literature is very much excluded from that field. But on the same hand, you have a lot of readers who are interested in the literature, and a lot of the bestsellers, the books that sell best, are popular literature. Etemadi is an example, but you also have a lot of female writers writing adabiyat osherane, romance, if you want, and these are very important to understand the industry. So it's interesting, because there's a dichotomy between what we think Iranian literature is and what we hear about when we hear about literary prices and discussions, and intellectuals discussing what's happening in the literary field. But at the same time, there's a bit of an avoidance of the topic of popular literature. I can recommend my student's work, Elam Naïd. She finished her PhD a couple of years ago, and she has written on the romances of writers, of Iranian writers, and this is really interesting to understand new trends. And to understand the diversity of the Iranian literary field.
Thank you, Dr. Nanquette. Dr. Farshad Sambolder asks a question. Could you provide some insights into the publication landscape of other Iranian languages within Iran?
Right. Again, that's something I want to work on later. There's publishing in Azerbaijani Turkish, there's publishing in Armenian, some in Kurdish, some in Arabic, but it's first, I'm only speaking Persian, so I'm limited in terms of the resources I can access. But it's a very tricky field, because there are few resources, and also because the Persianization of the state means that these resources are not easily accessible. But again, Mehrdad Raimi Moaddam is currently doing a PhD with me on Azerbaijani Turkish literature. So we have more people working on this, working on the issue of minority languages in Iran. So that's definitely a field to explore. Armenian, of course, is very important, because Armenians imported the print industry during the Safavid era, and they've been very active in terms of book production. But thanks for your question, and I will have more to say about this.
Thank you, Professor. The other question is about the Article 24. With reference to Article 24, quote, harmful to the principles of Islam, does it mean Does it mean that principles given in the Quran or their interpretations in the Sharia or Hadith?
Yes, that's a good question. If you look at the Iranian constitution on these matters, it's quite vague. So my reading of it is that it's not specific to the Quran. It's the principles of Islam as defined at the time by the Islamic Revolution. But they don't go into details of which principles, which hadith, and so on. And that's the interesting thing about how the Islamic Republic defines censorship. It's quite broad. The objectives of the book I mentioned do have quite specific regulations, but they change a lot. For example, in the 1988 objectives, you had specific guidelines about not publishing things on Israel and Zionism. But in the 2010 objectives, it's actually possible to publish on these topics if you're looking at it from a critical angle. So these objectives vary according to periods, and again, they're quite general, so they're very much open to interpretation.
Thank you. The other question is, what shifts did you observe in your research regarding the proportion of books by Iranian authors versus translations? And if there was a shift, what does it mean?
Yes, that's a great question. The question of translation is very important because the proportion of text you translate mostly from Western languages into Persian says something about your own cultural literary field. So translation has always been very, very important in Iran. You have a lot of variations, but it's usually around 30% of the total of books published, and in some sectors it's much higher. So in religious books, you would have more translation from Arabic, for example, but in fiction, you would have a lot more translations from English. And English is the top translated languages. You have a few translations from French, German, or some Asian languages like Chinese or Japanese, but it's very small compared to English. So that's a sign that the Iranian cultural field is very much attracted to the Western cultural field. And you do have recurrently attempts by the state to regulate this and to make sure that there's less translation and promotion of original publications in Persian, because of course the state wants to have more original publication. But mostly there's some variations like between 2 and 5% throughout the Islamic Republic period, but not anything significant.
Thank you very much. We have two questions about Franklin Book Program. One is asking what happened to the Franklin Book Program and is it still active today? And the other question asked whether it is active in the Middle East region today.
Yeah, so Franklin Book Program was a worldwide endeavor. They were active in Egypt as well. And in other regions of the world. So it was not only in Iran, it was a way for the state to counterbalance the influence of communism and the Soviet Union. So they decided to implant book programs in countries that both were receptive to it. And Franklin Book Program in Tehran was extremely successful in the way it worked and in the way it changed the publishing industry. What happened to Franklin? It was closed down in 1977 due to lack of U.S. funding. It was not due to the preliminaries of the revolution, it was merged with the Banga Tarjome va Nashr Kitab. So the two of them were merged to create a new publisher called Elmi Farhangi, which is a state publisher. Today it still exists, and it is sort of proud of its heritage. I mean, it's not rejecting the heritage of Franklin. It regularly publishes photos and documents about the heritage from Franklin, and it publishes histories of Franklin and where it's coming from. But it's a well-known publisher, but it's a state publisher, so it's got a very specific, defined endeavor, and it's not at all on the same scale as Franklin. It doesn't have the same cultural program. It doesn't have the same prestige.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Nanquette. The other question is about sanctions. How do international sanctions affect the output of books, if any?
Yeah, I don't see the question, but yes, sanctions are very important, and they affect very much the cultural field. If you just think of an Iranian writer who wants to have his text or her text published in Europe, you have a French publisher interested in it, for example, but the financial sanctions on transactions just make it absolutely impossible for the French publisher to pay copyright to the Iranian author. So just at that level, it makes things extremely difficult. It means that the Iranian writer would need to have an account in Europe, or so at the very basic level of exchanges between publishers and writers, sanctions are affecting very deeply the cultural field. Of course, it's important to note that the book and the cultural field in Iran are quite different from the rest of the book market, because Iran doesn't abide by copyright laws. So the way books circulate and are distributed in Iran are quite different from the rest of the world. So you can have, books by Western writers being published in Iran without having paid copyright, without the agreement of the writer. And these books circulate a lot, and they're very important in, creating a reading culture. But yes, the sanctions are very critical to the isolation of the book market, and the fact that the Iranian book market is very much separated from the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nanquette. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nanquette, for that very insightful talk. And thank you to everyone for submitting your questions. We got a lot more questions, and we will be sharing them with our guest so she can review them and maybe answer them directly. And thank you for joining us an early morning all the way from Australia. Special thanks to Dr. Janet Alfari, Ali Papoli Yazdi, and the entire team at UC Santa Barbara for organizing this annual lecture series with Farhang Foundation. As always, please visit farhang.org for all our latest upcoming events, talks, and programs. We thank you all for joining us from across the globe for today's talk, and we look forward to welcoming you back next time. Thank you again, Laetitia and Ali, for being part of this lecture today, and we bid you all farewell.
Thanks to both of you, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.